Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Finding Ruth by Cynthia Hamilton, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Prologue. Standing by the front door, looking through the window that allowed us to see past the dining room and into the kitchen, my sister, brother, and I stood fixated by the sight of our mother grabbing dishes from the cupboard and hurling them to the floor, using both hands for maximum force, spitting out her grievances with a passion and a voice we didn't recognize. We were mute, our eyes wide, our mouths slack as we watched on, ducking below the window whenever she happened to turn our direction. She may have seen us, but it had no effect on the process. She continued to rant and smash until she had either obliterated everything she found offensive or her anger had been sufficiently vented. I remember nothing about what precipitated this awesome and terrifying display of fury. My guess is we were outside playing when it began. As an adult looking back nearly 50 years, I can imagine any number of reasons for her outrage, all of them pointing to our father. She may have just learned that he had gambled away his paycheck, gotten arrested for drunk driving again, or had found evidence of another affair. At our tender ages of 9, 6, and 4, we knew nothing of the obstacles to a happy home life that our mother had faced from the beginning of their marriage. All we could sense was that something had gone terribly wrong in our world. When at last the ear-splitting din abruptly stopped and our mother left the room, presumably to have herself a good cry or a good think, I remember creeping into the kitchen by way of the garage and silently picking up the remnants of demolished dinnerware, the three of us bobbing up and down like little chickens as we endeavored to clean up the mess while making as little sound as possible. We may have been crying silently, I don't remember, but I do remember we had been scared into our best behavior. I also recall discovering our mother had limited her destruction to mostly the cheap stuff, leaving behind enough dishes to keep us from eating off paper plates. I remember feeling relieved that some of the treasured Stengel blueberry pottery had survived. Finding those hand-painted berries at the bottom of our yellow plates and bowls was one of those rituals fond childhood memories had been founded on. Looking back at her restraint, I wonder if it had been proximity alone that caused her to demolish the mismatched and plastic dishes, or if whatever precipitated the fit of rage had been aggravated by the fact she now found herself as a working mom with 3 young kids and an unreliable womanizer for a husband, constantly stretching every nickel as far as it would go. Did she wonder how she could have exhibited such bad judgment to have given up the solid, perhaps uneventful life with her first husband for this, being hamstrung by debt and the obligation of children, constantly forced to appeal to her parents for help? What I came to realize about our family as I started going to sleepovers was how closed in our nucleus was. I don't remember my parents ever entertaining. The cut crystal and the silver kept wrapped in plastic remnants of our mother's first marriage only came out of the cupboards on Thanksgiving or Christmas. As children, we got a big thrill out of their appearance, but I wonder now how my father felt about being reminded of his wife's former life. He was a man already plagued by insecurity. Unlike my mother, his fits of temper were frequent and impossible to avoid, and more unfathomable when fueled by alcohol. There were numerous reasons no one ever came over to our house, and when I realized how secluded our home life was compared to that of my friends, it shamed me. By the age of 12, I understood we were different, closed down, flawed, in some way not easily discernible to a child. Prior to and even after I began to feel the prison-like quality of our home, the one shared pride and joy was our mother. All children must see their mothers as beautiful. We had constant affirmation of this by total strangers. Whether at school, the grocery store, or the laundromat, men and women alike would lean over and tell us how lucky we were to have such a beautiful mother. It was both her blessing and her curse, the thing that drew men to her solely for her exterior. It's what had prompted some of them to fall to their knees and beg her to marry them. If you go through life with a face that infatuates people, your only saving grace must be having confidence in your character, your mind, and your intentions as a human being. You also need to have enough cynicism to realize who's sincere and who's only looking out for their own best interest. Having been raised by good, God-fearing Lutherans, I think the romantic, sensitive side of my mother was probably kept in check by the ingrained belief that one could never stop humbling oneself and doing for others. I think she gradually came to understand why men were so attracted to her, but she lacked the ability to screen out those who were sincere in their feelings for her from those who saw her as something they had to possess. I don't believe she had the awareness that people could be drawn to her solely for her looks. I only know for certain that for her being beautiful was more of a liability than a blessing. I've recently come to understand that memory is a fragile thing. If it is not preserved by frequent examination, you might find it has dried to dust and is apt to scatter into the air, lost except for the mere outline it has left behind. If the memory is only a placeholder for future detail between facts, then further fleshing out can become more speculation than truth, especially if the rightful owner of those memories has lost the ability to see into the past. What I have learned in the last few years is if you don't ask while you have the chance, your parents' past may become more fiction than fact. Chapter 1. In a Distracted State of Mind. Ruth paused for a second to straighten her hat before pushing through the plate glass door. As it closed itself behind her, the crisp late winter air of the outdoors was replaced with the warm, heavily scented humidity of a beauty parlor during peak hours. "Someone will be right with you," a woman called out over her shoulder after catching Ruth's reflection in the mirror along the back wall. The buzz of the beauticians and clientele abruptly halted as they regarded the stranger in their midst. Ruth let her eyes roam elsewhere. She feigned ignorance of the curious stares. Realizing no one was coming immediately to her assistance, she took a seat with her back to the street and busied herself by going through the contents of her handbag. After a quick appraisal, the 5 customers in various stages of beautification and the 4 stylists resumed their conversations. Only Maurice, the proprietor, kept a surreptitious watch on this stunning new face. After fingering his client's hair into bold waves around her face, he held his hand above her brows before he set the style with a blast of hairspray. "Close your eyes," he said, interrupting a story he had suddenly lost interest in. "What do you think?" he asked as he handed the freshly minted platinum blonde a hand mirror and turned her chair around so she could take in the back of the head. "I hardly recognize myself," she said, awestruck by the transformation. "You could have some fun with Ronald," Mrs. Latimer quipped before returning her attention to her movie magazine. "Stand up, Betty, I can't see it," the patron on the end complained. Maurice swiveled the chair back around and removed the cloth drape. With a smile of delight spreading across her features, Mrs. Andrews stood and effected several starlit poses for her audience. "Bravo! Darling! I told you you'd look like Marilyn Monroe if you went lighter and shorter, doesn't she?" "I don't know about that, Trish," Betty automatically replied, though she had a hard time taking her eyes off her newly glamorized image. "You look 10 years younger," Louise said confidentially as she escorted Mrs. Andrews to the front desk to collect her payment. "Are you here to see Maurice?" she asked the newcomer while she rang up her boss's last customer. "Yes," Ruth replied. "He'll be right with you," Louise said. The well-rehearsed reason behind her appointment died on Ruth's lips as the conversation resumed without her. "Mrs. Patterson?" Maurice asked solicitously as he materialized to her right. His enigmatic smile could have been interpreted as either cordial, smarmy, or predatory, depending on the recipient's point of view. "Yes," Ruth replied, far too eager for her own comfort, startled as she was by his sudden appearance. "I'm here to get my hair done for the charity luncheon tomorrow." She stood up self-consciously, finding herself outside the element she had become accustomed to. Marrying into a prominent Wichita family, it had been impossible to glide through her daily life without explaining who she was or where she fit in the scheme of things. Rarely did she venture outside the circle that swallowed her when she became Mrs. John Blakely Patterson, Jr. Generally, those she encountered at the museum, country club, shopping, or out dining all knew who she was, usually without having been introduced. It came with the turf, as did doing what was expected of her. She was a Patterson now, a privileged and somewhat confining role. Only on rare occasions such as this was she reminded of her lofty position in society. Having to present herself without her acquired pedigree paving the way put her at a psychological disadvantage. What she lacked in confidence, though, this man made up for in spades. The hairdresser she usually saw, Lawrence, a man considered a wizard by her mother-in-law said, was aloof and egotistical, older than this Maurice by at least 10 years, a prima donna too infatuated with his own importance to be interested in anything his clientele had to say. At first sight, Maurice appeared to be the exact opposite. He was dark-haired and vivacious. The slight gap between his front teeth gave his grin a rakish sincerity. His smile said he didn't take himself or anyone else too seriously. Maurice extended his arm to indicate the recently vacated chair, but his smile faltered as he became distracted by the vibes emanating from the gaggle of nosing onlookers as Ruth followed his cue. He felt 8 sets of eyes following this new creature, well-groomed and elegant, her ingrained poise and erect posture making her seem as out of place in his humble salon as a thoroughbred giving pony rides. As Ruth headed toward the chair, Maurice changed her course. "Is the back room clean?" he asked his staff at large. "It should be," one of his stylists answered. "No one's been in there today." "Too claustrophobic in here," Maurice said under his breath as he guided Ruth toward a hallway separated from the main salon by a heavy brocade drapery. Ruth glanced over her shoulder once Maurice had taken the lead, looking back at a room full of curious stares. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears and acute embarrassment washed over her. She felt as though everyone knew what was going on except her. "After you," Maurice said, his back to the door as he stood out of the way, seemingly oblivious to his new client's discomfort. Weak sunlight from a grimy alley window gave the small room an even more closed-in feel. He flipped on an overhead light, revealing a single sink, hydraulic chair, and a hooded hairdryer on one side, a worn leather sofa, coffee table, and a makeshift wet bar on the other. Ruth turned toward Maurice, her expression both confused and alarmed. "Trust me, this is much better," he preempted her as he closed the door partway, sending a message he was in session but could be interrupted if necessary, a move that reassured Ruth, only a little. "You would have had no peace with that pack of female jackals out there. They wouldn't have let up until they got every who, what, and why out of you." He turned the chair towards her, and she gracefully arranged herself in it. He rotated the chair until she was facing the mirror. "So," he said, more to himself than to her, "let's see what we've got here." He motioned with a nod of his head for Ruth to take off her hat while he fished a pack of cigarettes out of his shirt pocket. He lit one and took a meditative drag, blowing the smoke out the side of his mouth, away from her. Ruth glanced at the mirror as her hands sought the pin holding her hat in place against the blustery Wichita wind. Her eyes flitted to the side and caught Maurice's gaze. His dark eyes slightly narrowed against a trail of cigarette smoke as he regarded her with a look she couldn't quite read. He took another drag and set the cigarette on an ashtray to his left. She lifted the hat, black velvet surrounding a bed of snowy white feathers, and slid the pearl-studded pin back through for safekeeping. He took it and placed it on the counter out of harm's way. He murmured speculatively as his fingers coaxed Ruth's hair out of the French twist, gently pulling it taut as he judged the length and texture. With it down, she looked even younger than her 25 years, wholesome and pure, like a farm girl, only much more sophisticated. "So how did you get yourself roped into this fashion show?" he asked irreverently. Ruth laughed, surprised by Maurice's candor. Despite her reserve, her laughter was louder and more abrupt than he expected. It gave him the impression it was rusty from lack of use. "My father-in-law sits on the board of directors at St. John's Hospital, and his wife chairs the committee that planned this event. Saying no would have been out of the question." She allowed herself a small smile, just to hint there was a cynical, playful nature under that decorous exterior. A lopsided smirk flickered across Maurice's face just long enough for Ruth to get the idea he appreciated sarcasm, a trait they apparently shared. As far as she could tell, it was about the only thing they had in common. Maurice let her hair drop and took one more pull from his cigarette before laying out the tools of his trade. "How do you feel about going for a little more color?" he asked after expelling a plume of smoke out of the corner of his mouth, away from her. He pulled a book of sample shades from an overhead cupboard and laid it on the counter next to the sink. "Color? Yeah, red. More auburn, really. Nothing too bright, just a little more modern. Glamorous. Not to say you're backward or frumpy." Maurice gave her another mischievous smile, which made Ruth blush. He flipped to the section he was looking for and removed 2 samples and held them up to her face. Her complexion was pale, almost alabaster, which on her looked good. It highlighted her features. As pale as she was, her teeth still gleamed in bright contrast against her lips. He had seen more than his share of beautiful women in his 30 years on the planet, but none as striking as this one. He traded the swatches of hair for 2 others, his head wagging side to side as he deliberated. He let one hand drop as he narrowed his choice. "What do you think? Can you see yourself with ravishing russet, or perhaps alluring auburn?" he asked as he held up the loops of synthetic hair separately. Ruth croaked out a doubtful laugh. "I'm not sure I could see myself as either." "Oh, come on now. What's the harm in trying something new?" Maurice asked with a mild reproach. "Well, for one thing, I would have to come in every 3 weeks for a touch-up." "Would that really be a bad thing?" Ruth caught his eyes in the mirror, and reading the playfulness in them, she laughed in spite of her better judgment. Agreeing to a change of hair color may have been her most reckless moment in her adult life, but it felt liberating. Besides, she reassured herself, it wasn't something that couldn't be undone. With a tentative nod and the fatalistic bravery of a gambler, she gave her consent and sat back to enjoy this rare act of daring.